So the request which came through to me via David and Bettina was for a short series of trainings on designing right-N trials with farmers. And so that's what I'm going to try and cover. And, you know, even in the title, there's a lot to think about. What do we mean by design, and what's the process for designing? What do we mean by right, and why should we ever do something that's wrong? When we talk about right N, what do we mean by N? What is N? Trials, so we're talking about experiments, which are mainly field experiments in our work, but actually a lot of the messages which I hope and principles that we learn during these sessions are actually valid to other types of studies as well. And it is all supposed to be about work and experiments we do with farmers. And the fact that farmers can be involved at any stage in the process is something we need to keep remembering. This is not just a scientific process of researchers designing what they think is best. It should be part of a participatory process in which farmers are also involved. So the way that we've set up this short webinar series is that each Friday we'll make a short presentation and maybe have a discussion, and then set a small task. You work on the task during the coming days, and by Thursday of next week, you send the results of the task to us by email, that is to David and myself. And then the following Friday, we can discuss what you managed to do on that task before then going on to the next presentation. And the idea is that the tasks are just about actually designing a real experiment, something that you really plan to implement during the coming season. So I suspect that in most cases, the task is very easy for you to complete because it's something you've actually already done, but we'll see. On the basis of what you hear during the presentation, you might want to update the plans that you have in place at the moment for the experiment. And then we can have a look at that updated work before going on to the next step. And I should say at the beginning that when we talk about design for a trial, we're talking about the complete plan. It doesn't make sense to think about one part of the plan, for example, what the treatments are or the options being compared. You can't think about that without thinking about everything else. So when statisticians talk about design of experiments, they maybe think that it's, you know, something like a randomized block design with 6 repetitions. But for our work, when we're talking about the design of a trial, we're talking about everything, the objectives and why they're there, the overall approach that you're using, how you're choosing the places where you're going to work and the participants who are going to take part. The treatments or options compared are there, but all of this, the measurements you're going to make, how farmers are engaged, how the whole thing is going to be implemented, these are all part of the plan or the design, because they all interact with each other. You can't talk sensibly about one of those pieces without understanding the other pieces. Just at the beginning here, I'll just point out one thing. If you've learnt about experimental design when you studied, then certainly you will have heard some names of experimental designs, like randomized complete block designs. I can't remember what the French is for that, but there are French equivalents to these. And researchers often think that designing an experiment means picking one of these types of designs that they've learned of, like an RCBD, or like a split plot design. Now, for the sort of work we're doing now, these old names just aren't appropriate. For the kind of designs that we're using now, which are appropriate for the sort of work that CCRP is doing with farmers, the names that we had before just don't work. They're not appropriate. So rather than thinking about what's the name of this design, think about what you're going to do and why you're going to do it like that, and not bother about what to call it. The things we're doing now really don't have names. The whole of the process of designing a good experiment, whether it's an experiment with farmers or not, is built on the objectives. The objectives drive all the decisions, or they should drive all the decisions. And that's why for this first session, I want to focus on getting the objectives right. And then in the next session, we're going to look at some other steps. And of these steps, which I've illustrated here, oops, for some reason, my computer's moving on by itself, but never mind, okay. Farmers can be involved at any stage. I'm not going to focus in these talks on exactly how to involve farmers. Those are things that you have methods and you have ways of doing that within your project. But let's not think of farmers only being involved at this stage at the bottom there, the implementation. There are good reasons why farmers should be involved in setting objectives, in deciding the overall approaches to use, in choosing the details, collecting data, interpreting data. Okay. So the topics which we'll try and cover in this series, it's objectives today. Next week, we'll talk about the overall approach and look more at the questions about size, because the real motivation for this series was getting N right, and N is something to do with the size of the experiment. The third one will be on choosing measurements, and the fourth one will be about implementation. So that's the overall scheme we've got. Okay. Within CCRP and many other programs these days, we've realized it's very useful to think about the research we're doing in terms of two dimensions. And I've tried to represent them on this graph. The first dimension, the horizontal dimension, is the N dimension. And N is the number of environments or contexts or participants that are involved in the study. So at the left-hand end, we have N equals 1. That means doing research at a single place or a single environment or a single context. And at the right-hand end of that horizontal axis, we have many, a large N, where we're doing a lot of environments or a lot of participants are involved. And on the vertical axis, we have the level of farmer participation in the research. And the bottom of the axis is none, and the axis goes from a low level of participation to a high level of participation. And if we look at conventional agricultural research, it's all down here in the bottom left-hand corner of this graph. All the methods that you learned when you studied agriculture and all the methods that everybody around the world learns when they study agriculture are really all down here. So the conventional approaches to experimental design, they work at a few, either one site or maybe a small number of sites or environments, and they have no farmer involvement, or perhaps a very low level of farmer involvement. Now, participation of farmers is important really for two core reasons. One is because if your objectives include understanding some social aspect of technology, you have to involve farmers, because you can't find out about, for example, social acceptability of a technology if farmers don't use it and then give you their answers about what they think about it. So many of our objectives these days require farmers to be involved because of what we're trying to find out. But we also often want farmer participation more for an ethical reason or a question of values. And this is the question of empowerment. It just seems right. If we're doing research for farmers, then farmers should somehow be involved. They have a, it's like human rights. They have a human right to be involved in the research which is supposed to be for them. And so those are the reasons why participation of farmers is important. And you know that participatory research became very popular about 25 years ago. And there was a big increase in methods available, and lots of people started using it. But nearly always that participatory research that was done involved fairly small numbers of farmers. The reason for that is because the research was seen as intensive. It's labor intensive and expensive. It requires a lot of researcher involvement. So although we liked to involve farmers, we could never do that with very many farmers. And if you look at participatory research starting from around about 1990, typically there was no studies done with more than about 30 farmers involved. Okay. Now, along this x-axis, we now look at number of environments or the number of participants. And that's important because if you want to understand how technologies work in different contexts or different environments, you have to work in many different contexts or many different environments. Small n, being at the left-hand end of this axis, is fine if you think the same technology or the same option is going to be appropriate for everyone everywhere. But if you think that the results are going to depend on many different factors, and I've listed some of them there, if you think that is possible, then you have to do your study in many different environments to be able to understand what's going on. Okay? So the whole question about right n is trying to decide where do we need to be along this x-axis. Do we need just a few environments or contexts or participants, or do we need very large numbers, or is there somewhere in between that we can be? So now for most of the research that CCRP projects are doing, it's clear that we do need farmer participation because the research requires farmer participation for those reasons I said. And we also need to have generally more rather than few contexts because we know that there are interactions with environment. And that means the research which we need to do is going to sit up here somewhere in this top right-hand corner of the graph. And that's new. Okay, this is a research frontier. How you do this, what the designs look like, what the methods are for working here is new. You don't find it in textbooks. You don't find it in what you were taught when you were studying. And that's why we struggle to to introduce it, and we struggle to understand it, and we struggle to help projects understand it and use it, because it is new. So we're all learning at the same time how to actually do that. And that's why we need a series of webinars now, and we can't just give you the textbook that has all the answers in it, because the textbook does not exist. So I said we concentrate on objectives, and I want to just talk a little bit about the level of P, the level of participation, and how that's related to objectives. And first, just a reminder, participation can mean participation by farmers or other stakeholders in any or all of these steps, in choosing the objectives, choosing the options to look at, choosing exactly how the design, the details of the design, how the trial will work, in management, measurement, analysis. And I've listed there types of objectives that require a high level of participation, and types of objectives where a low level of participation is okay, or perhaps even better. So you can see on the left, high participation needed if you want to understand social acceptability and preference, farmers' preferences for options. If farmers are not completely involved in choosing and trying out things, then they can't give you an opinion about how good it is. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, if what you're interested in is the biophysical performance, like crop yield, then maybe you don't need such a high level of participation. So the other rows in the left-hand side of that table there give examples of objectives that require a high level of participation. If you want to understand how the technologies fit into farm and livelihood systems, farmers have got to be very involved. On the other hand, if you're only interested in interactions with environmental factors like soil or position in the landscape, then the participation doesn't have to be high. If you're interested in farmers' innovations, their ideas on how they might change the technology, obviously you need a high level of participation. If you think, you know, the researchers have done all the designing of the technology and now it just needs testing, then maybe you need less farmer involvement. And of course, if you believe that farmers should be able to influence the direction of the research, then they need to be involved. If you've done that in some other part of your project, maybe they don't have to be involved in designing this particular study. Maybe they've already agreed that this study is the right thing to do, and they're happy for you to do the design on your own. So the point is that you need to think carefully exactly what the objectives are and the level of farmer participation and the stages at which they need to participate in to meet those particular objectives. And we can do the same thing now on thinking about objectives and the level of N. Are we going to be towards the left of my diagram with just a few farmers or a few sites or involved, or do we need to be towards the right? And the first thing to mention here is the first thing to understand is that this depends on how much context variation you're actually interested in. So I'll give you an example. The objective I wrote down is to understand how preference for new varieties, for example, new varieties of cowpea, how does that depend on gender, soil type, and livestock ownership, whether the household owns livestock. That's my objective. So if I think about, obviously, if I'm going to meet that objective, I've got to have a study that has both men and women in it, because I want to compare the results from men with the results from women. So the first factor I need to look at would be gender, and that has two levels, men and women. The second factor is soil type. And just I made this up out of my head, but I've decided there are three types of soil that I need to investigate. I've called sandy soil with low phosphorus. Sorry, this is confusing. P here means phosphorus, not participation. Okay, sandy with low phosphorus, sandy with high phosphorus, and clay soil. So I've just made this up in this example, but if you thought those were the main three types of soil to investigate, you'd say, all right, we need there are three types of soil. When I think about livestock ownership, I've decided that also has three levels. I think there might be a difference between those that have no livestock, those that have a few livestock, and those that have a lot. So that's also got three levels. So if you now think about all the combinations, you multiply those together, and there are 18 combinations. That means, you know, men with clay soil and no livestock, or women with sandy, low phosphorus soil with a few livestock. Altogether, the combinations you might have come to 18. If we then think of, for my study of understanding preferences, I need a reasonable sample of farmers for each one of those combinations. So I say maybe I need 10 farmers for each of those 18 combinations. That means I'm going to need about 18 times 10 is 180 farmers involved in this study. Now, the 10 there, it depends on all sorts of things, whether it's 10 or whether it's 20 or whether it's 5. That depends on many things. But 10 is often a typical sort of number we should be aiming for. It's quite reasonable for many types of cases. So if we do that calculation, that sort of a thinking for this particular problem, my example, then it tells us that the right N is going to be about 180 people involved. Okay? So think of this just as a guide. So here I've said, all right, 180, let's call it 200. For those objectives, N of 200 would probably be about okay. And the way you should interpret that is not that it needs to be exactly 200, but that if you were thinking of having 20 farmers, then you know that's far too small. And if you were thinking of having 2,000 farmers, that's much larger than you need for those particular objectives. There might be other considerations as well. There are other things that need to be thought about, and I will list some of those in a minute. And those will generally increase the size of N you need. If you do an analysis like this, and you come to a conclusion like here, that N needs to be about 180 or 200, and that's much bigger than you can manage. Maybe you know that your budget will only manage a study with 50 farmers involved. Then you need to go back and look at the objectives and simplify them. If I go back to my example here, if N of 180 is too big, and I can only manage, for example, 1/3 of that, I might have to knock out one of those factors and say, all right, I'm not going to consider livestock ownership. I'm only going to consider the gender and the soil type. And if I only do that, then I'd end up with an N of 60 as being a sort of minimum possible size for the study. But what it's wrong to do is to do this kind of calculation, see that the N that comes is much larger than you can manage, and then just go ahead with a small N without changing the objectives. That's just a waste of effort, because your study will fail to meet those objectives, and you're just a wasted time and effort. Okay. So when you're trying to do this analysis, there's quite a process to go through. And this, I think, is the process you need to think about. The first is to list those factors which might be important. And I've just put a list here. There are very many possible things that in the sort of work that we're doing, like cowpea varieties, there are very many factors that you might consider as important. So biophysical ones, like soil type, like landscape niche. By landscape niche, I mean, is it on the riverbank? Is it in the valley? Is it on the rocky hillside? The agroecological zone. How many trees? Are we talking about somewhere with parklands with a lot of trees, or are we talking about somewhere which is completely open? What about land use history? That might be important sometimes. In other words, are these fields that have had legumes on many often, or are these fields that have only ever had cereals in before? What about the level of striga infestation, and so on? There are many other examples. There are social ones like gender, like ethnic group, like whether people belong to a farmer's group or not, like family size, and whether they have worked previously with projects. All these are social type factors that often have an influence on what we're doing. And then there are economic ones, like how much labor somebody has available, about whether they're integrated with markets and growing for markets, about whether they own animals for doing the plowing or not, and so on. So if you start listing out the factors that you think might be important for what you're studying, you often get a very long list. And you can't use all these to design your trial. It's too many. If you did the analysis, which I've just done, with all these factors, you'd come to the conclusion that you needed an N of millions. It's just completely impractical. So the next thing to do is to rank them and pick out the ones that you think are really most important. And this means most important for your project, are going to be most useful to help you progress with your project plan and your project ideas. So for example, I just, I picked up 6 here. Maybe these are my six priorities. I've numbered there. Right? There they are. I can then start thinking about, okay, for each of those, how many levels do I have? Like, how many different soil types am I thinking of? Or how many different levels of labor availability am I going to define? I can then check that actually that these combinations of factors occur. So for example, maybe I have gender, and I have men and women, and I have ownership of draft animals as 2 factors. And then I realized that actually none of the women farmers own draft animals. So the combination of women with draft animals doesn't actually apply. So I can maybe reduce the number of combinations I have to look at. But then you do that, and you try and do the analysis, which I did in my example earlier, to come to an estimate of the size of trial, the N that you need, and just check that that's realistic. If it is, that's great. If it's not, you need to repeat, and you need to think, all right, what am I going to simplify? Which of these factors am I going to try and drop from my study design? Now, all that is about all that is just thinking through the context that might be there and trying to come to a conclusion about the size of sample you need. There are other considerations here about the level of N, the number of farmers that you might need to include. So, for example, you might want to continue working with farmers who've been involved before. That's fine. Maybe last time you worked with 200 farmers, and if you now think you need 50, but the other 150 would like to be involved, well, that's fine. I know within Fumogaskia, they want members want to take part. All the members would like, or many of the members would like to take part in studies. And so for that project, then, how many members there are who want to take part is probably going to be as important as calculating the number of farmers needed for particular objectives. There's also the idea in many projects of moving the research to scale. In other words, don't think about the trial just as producing research results, but think about it as also being part of the process of introducing farmers to technology and letting the technology spread. So that's also, maybe we say, well, we only need 200 farmers for the trial, but we'd like this year to get the technology introduced to 500 new farmers. So we do the trial with 500 farmers. It doesn't matter. And then the last one I put there is links to other project components. There might be other activities that you're doing in the project that involve working with different numbers of farmers, and there are good reasons to connect that activity with this one. So I know in East Africa, we have projects where they're doing variety evaluations with farmers using what they hope are right end trials, but they're also having farmers producing seed, quality seed. So there are two linked activities there. The number of and you need to make sure that the numbers work for both. The number of farmers that are going to be producing seed and the number of farmers who are taking part in the trial. So it's not just the statistical considerations of numbers involved. All right, there was one slide I skipped, and this was in the wrong place. This was just about hypotheses and whether your objective should include writing down hypotheses. And I'm flexible on this. Some researchers would say, of course, if you're doing research, you have to have a hypothesis. I can think of writing down objectives and not being able to write down useful hypotheses. But sometimes if you can write down a hypothesis, it helps focus your attention. It helps you think about what's really important when you're designing the rest of the trial. And a hypothesis here is really what you expect to happen and why you think it might happen. So I've got an example here. My example hypothesis is women will prefer traditional varieties because they taste better, and for the women, food production is a priority. Men prefer new varieties because they're growing for markets and they consider yield as the most important. There's my hypothesis. Right? So if that's a reasonable sort of hypothesis, then having written it down like that helps us design the trial, because we can see some of the things that we're going to have to do in the trial design. We're going to have to assess taste, for example, because our hypothesis says the traditional varieties taste better, and it's taste that women are using to set their variety choice. Right? So because of the writing down the hypothesis, we can see straight away something we're going to have to include in the trial design, which is assessing taste. So those hypotheses should be, I've said here, something that are reasonable. Okay, they're things that could well be true, but you don't already know that they are true. So it's sometimes quite tricky to think of something which is realistic to expect that to happen, but we don't know that it will happen. If you already know it, you don't need to do that trial. You can assume that that's true and do something different. So it should be something unknown, but it shouldn't be something which is completely outrageous, something which is unlikely to happen. Okay? So if you can come up with these hypotheses, then it helps focus the discussion of objectives and helps determine other elements of the design. Okay. So overall, this is what I think is the process for defining your objectives. First of all, list those questions that you have, questions or aims and hypotheses included, if you can. And those almost certainly will include questions about interactions with context. In other words, they will include things about how do the technology options, like new varieties, how do they interact with gender or with type of farmer or with soil type or something like that. You then list other objectives as well. So those are the objectives like, you know, we have an objective of involving all the members, or we have an objective of introducing new varieties to more farmers at the same time. Right? So you're going to list all those components, both the scientific or research objectives. And I notice I said the scientific ones can be social and biophysical research. List any other objectives you have, and then you need to look at them carefully and say, is it reasonable to try and achieve all these objectives in one activity? If not, you might decide that you're going to end up designing two different activities, but you need to look carefully at that. Make sure it makes sense to have everything in one study. You need to do some negotiating with farmers or other stakeholders about objectives if you haven't already done that. In going through those steps, you're very likely to decide that what your first idea is unrealistic. It doesn't work. So you need to go back, do some revision. Often it means making objectives simpler, and then going through again. And eventually you'll have some definite objectives, and those are the things which we can then use to drive the rest of the design. So if we think of this circle of steps as being the design process, what I'm saying is being the research process, that you're going to have to probably go round in circles a few times just defining the objectives. Try it, evaluate them amongst yourselves with the other stakeholders, including perhaps some farmer representatives. Make sure those objectives are sensible. Once you've got those objectives, what we're then going to do is go on and define the overall approach for the study. And when we do that, we might again find that it's too hard to meet those objectives. We can't come up with a good approach. And then when we come on to details, again, we might have to go back to look at the objectives again. But those are the later steps. Okay. So what I'd like you to try and do before the meeting next Friday is just to look at the objectives which you've set down for a trial or several trials that you're planning to implement this coming season, and see, on the basis of everything I've talked about this morning, see whether you want to update those objectives at all, and then send them to us. You can send them to me, you can send them to David by Thursday morning, and then we've got a day to look at them. And then at the beginning of the session next week, we'll give you any comments you have on any comments we have on the objectives that you've set for your trials. And then we'll move on to the next step of defining the overall approach and some of the details for the study.